In a town where whispers carried more weight than evidence, one woman stood alone against a lie so heavy it could bury her alive. The sun hung low over Redstone Valley, painting the wooden storefronts in shades of amber and rust. It was a Tuesday, but the streets were quieter than a Sunday sermon. No one lingered at the general store. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Even the stray dogs that usually prowled the alleys seemed to sense the weight in the air, tucking their tails and slinking away. Today wasn't just any day in Redstone Valley. It was the day the townsfolk gathered to watch a reckoning. At the heart of the town stood the courthouse, its whitewashed walls gleaming like a false promise under the morning sky. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind that made your skin prickle and your heart beat a little too fast. Men in pressed vests and women clutching lace handkerchiefs filled the pews, their murmurs rising like a swarm of restless bees. They weren't here for justice, though they'd swear they were. They were here for a story, one they'd already written in their minds before the gavel ever fell. Her name was Clara Voss, though most in Redstone just called her the seamstress. Not because she sewed for a living, but because she was always stitching together the lives of others, mending the hems of the wealthy, patching the dreams of the forgotten. Clara was no stranger to hard work. Her hands, calloused and steady, had threaded needles for the wives of bankers and merchants, her quiet smile earning her just enough to keep a roof over her head. But today those hands were bound in iron and her smile was nowhere to be found. Clara sat alone at the defendant's table, her gray dress dusted with the red clay of the valley's roads. Her dark hair was pulled back, revealing a face too young for the shadows beneath her eyes. She was 24, but the weight of the town's judgment aged her in ways years never could. They said she'd killed Amos Carver, the town's wealthiest landowner, a man whose name was carved into every cornerstone of Redstone Valley. Poison, they whispered. A bitter draft slipped into his evening whiskey, and Clara, his quiet, unassuming seamstress, was the only one in his grand house when he took his last breath. The crowd didn't care that Clara had no family to vouch for her, no friends to fill the benches at her side. They didn't care that Amos Carver's wealth came from foreclosing on farms or that his temper was as notorious as his generosity to the church. To them, Clara was an outsider, a woman with no roots, no husband, no place in their carefully ordered world. Her silence in the face of their accusations only fueled their certainty. Why wouldn't she speak? Why wouldn't she beg? A guilty woman, they decided, had no words worth hearing. Outside, the wind carried the faint clatter of wagon wheels and the distant lowing of cattle. But inside the courthouse, time seemed to pause. The prosecutor, a man with a voice like a revival preacher, stood tall, his polished boots gleaming as he paced before the jury. In his hand, he held a small glass vial, its contents glinting like liquid midnight. "This," he declared, his voice cutting through the room, "is nightshade, the poison that stole Amos Carver's life. And this woman," he pointed at Clara, his finger trembling with righteous fury. "This woman wielded it like a dagger in the dark." The crowd leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of scandal. No one asked why Amos Carver kept such a vial in his own study. No one wondered what a seamstress who barely earned enough to buy bread could gain from his death. And no one noticed the faint scar across Clara's knuckles, a mark that hadn't been there a month ago. Clara's gaze remained fixed on the floor, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't flinch at the prosecutor's words or the crowd's murmurs. She'd learned long ago that words couldn't mend a world determined to tear you apart. But as the gavel struck, signaling the trial's start, a shadow moved at the edge of town. A stranger on a horse, his coat dusted with the miles. He'd traveled, his eyes fixed on the courthouse. Who was he, and why had he come to Redstone Valley on the day Clara Voss faced her fate? The courthouse in Redstone Valley was a furnace, not just from the Nevada sun pressing through the windows, but from the heat of 100 accusing eyes burning into Clara Voss. The wooden benches creaked under the weight of the townsfolk, their whispers weaving a noose tighter than any rope. Clara sat still, her bound hands resting in her lap. her gray dress catching flecks of dust that danced in the slanting light. She didn't look at the jury, nor at the judge, whose silver hair gleamed like a crown of authority. Her gaze lingered on the floorboards, tracing the knots in the wood as if they held answers no one else cared to seek. The prosecutor, Caleb Hawthorne, was in his element, his voice rising and falling like a hymn meant to stir souls. Clara Voss, he declared, pausing to let the name hang like a curse, was no mere seamstress. She was a shadow in Amos Carver's home, a woman who saw his wealth, his power, and envied it. He paced, his boots thudding against the floor, each step a hammer driving a nail into Clara's fate. She slipped nightshade into his whiskey, a poison so cruel it stole his breath before he could cry out. And for what? Greed? Revenge? We may never know, for she refuses to speak. The crowd nodded, some fanning themselves with folded newspapers, others clutching their children close as if Clara's silence might taint them. No one questioned the story Caleb wove. No one asked why Amos Carver, a man known for his iron grip on Redstone's land and lives, would let a seamstress near his private study. No one mentioned the rumors that had swirled for years, of Carver's late-night rages, of the maids who left his employ with bruises they wouldn't explain, of the tenants who lost their homes when they crossed him. To the town, Amos was a balm, saint in death, his flaws buried with him in the churchyard. Clara's attorney, Thomas Reed, rose shakily, his too large suit sagging at the shoulders. He cleared his throat, the sound swallowed by the room's restless hum. Your Honor, the evidence is circumstantial, he said, his voice barely reaching the jury. There's no proof Clara purchased the nightshade, no witnesses to the act. Perhaps Mr. Carver's death was an accident. The judge, Gideon Holt, leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. An accident, Mr. Reed? Poison doesn't pour itself. A ripple of laughter broke through the crowd, and Thomas shrank back, his notes trembling in his hands. Clara didn't react. She'd heard laughter like that before. Sharp, cutting, the kind that followed her when she walked through town with her head down, her basket of thread and needles clutched tight. She'd come to Redstone Valley 3 years ago, fleeing a past she never spoke of, not even to the kind-eyed widow who rented her a room above the tailor's shop. Back then, she'd hoped for a fresh start, a place where her stitches could weave a life of quiet dignity. But Redstone wasn't kind to women like her, women with no name to lean on, no man to claim them. She'd learned to move softly, to speak only when spoken to let the world forget her. Now, it seemed, the world had remembered her in the worst way. As Caleb called his first witness, a housekeeper who swore she'd seen Clara linger too long in Carver's study, Clara's thoughts drifted to the man himself. Amos Carver hadn't been just her employer. He'd been a storm disguised as a gentleman. His smile charmed the town, but behind his mahogany doors, his words were sharp as a whip. He'd hired Clara to mend his linens, but his demands grew heavier with time. Stay late, fetch his whiskey, listen to his rants about rivals and debts. Once, when she'd dropped a glass, his hand had struck her cheek, leaving a mark she hid with her shawl for weeks. He'd apologized the next day, slipping her an extra coin, but his eyes held no regret, only a warning. The housekeeper's testimony painted a different picture. A cunning Clara, always watching, always scheming. She asked questions. The woman said, her voice trembling with rehearsed indignation. About Mr. Carver's business, his medicines, I told her to mind her place. The jury leaned in, their faces hard with judgment. No one asked why a seamstress would care about Carver's ledgers. No one wondered what she'd endured in that house, where every door locked from the outside. Clara's eyes lifted, just for a moment scanning the room. She saw the grocer, who'd once thanked her for sewing his daughter's wedding dress, now staring at his boots. She saw the schoolteacher, who'd borrowed her needle to mend a torn book, now whispering to her neighbor. And she saw the preacher, who'd preached about mercy but sat silent as Caleb's words twisted her life into a lie. They'd all known her, in their way, but none of them knew her now. To them, she was a story, not a soul. Outside, The wind howled, rattling the courthouse shutters like a warning. In the distance, the stranger from the edge of town tethered his horse to a post, his boots kicking up red dust as he moved toward the saloon across the square. He didn't join the crowd, didn't push through the courthouse doors. Instead, he leaned against a weathered beam, his hat tilted low, his eyes fixed on the building where Clara's fate hung by a thread. The bartender, wiping a glass that didn't need cleaning, watched him warily. "You here for the trial?" he asked, his voice low. The stranger didn't answer. He just waited, his shadow long and still, like a storm gathering on the horizon. What did he know about Clara Voss, and what truth was he waiting to unleash? The courtroom in Redstone Valley hummed with the restless energy of a storm about to break. The prosecutor, Caleb Hawthorne, had just sat down, his smug smile lingering as the housekeeper's damning testimony echoed in the air. Clara Voss remained, still her hands bound, her gray dress catching the faint glow of a sunbeam that dared to pierce the dusty windows. The judge, Gideon Holt, raised his gavel, ready to call the next witness, when a low creak cut through the murmurs like a blade. Every head turned. The courthouse doors swung open, and a shadow stepped into the light. He was tall, his silhouette framed by the glare of the Nevada sun. Dust clung to his long coat, the kind worn by men who lived on the road, and his boots left faint red streaks on the polished floor. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but his eyes, sharp, unyielding, the color of a winter sky, swept the room with a quiet authority that made the air feel heavier. A revolver rested low on his hip, its handle worn smooth by years of use. The townsfolk froze, their whispers dying as if the wind itself had stolen their breath. They knew him, or thought they did. His name was whispered in saloons and stables, a legend carved in blood and shadow. Jonah Kane. Jonah Kane wasn't just a man in Redstone Valley. He was a myth. A bounty hunter who'd tracked outlaws across the Sierras. A drifter who'd vanished 5 years ago after a job no one dared speak of. Some said he'd died in a canyon shootout. Others swore he'd ridden into the desert and never looked back. But here he was, standing in their courthouse, his presence like a spark in a powder keg. The bartender from across the square, who'd watched him earlier, felt his throat tighten. The preacher's wife clutched her shawl, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Even Judge Holt paused, his gavel hovering as if unsure whether to strike or surrender. Jonah didn't rush. He walked down the center aisle, each step deliberate, the faint jingle of his spurs the only sound in the stunned silence. Clara's eyes lifted from the floor, meeting his for the first time. A flicker of recognition passed through her gaze, gone as quickly as it came, like a candle snuffed out by the wind. She didn't speak, didn't move, but her hands tightened in her lap, the iron cuffs biting into her wrists. Jonah stopped a few feet from the defendant's table, his coat swaying slightly as he turned to face the crowd. "I've got something to say," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel under a wagon wheel. It wasn't loud, but it carried, cutting through the room with the weight of a man who knew the cost of every word. Caleb Hawthorne shot to his feet, his face reddening. "This is a court of law, sir. You have no right to interrupt." Jonah didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Clara, steady, unwavering, as if she were the only soul in the room. "I've got every right," he said. "She's my sister." The courtroom erupted, gasps, and murmurs collided, chairs scraping as people leaned forward or turned to their neighbors. A child in the back whimpered, quickly hushed. Judge Holt slammed his gavel, the sound sharp but futile against the chaos. "Order," he bellowed, his face flushed. "Order in this court." But the crowd was beyond order, their eyes darting between Jonah and Clara, searching for truth in a claim that felt both impossible and inevitable. Clara's face remained unreadable, but her shoulders tensed, a crack in the armor of her silence. Jonah reached into his coat, slow and careful, pulling out a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with age. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a letter from our mother written before she died. It names us both, Clara Voss and Jonah Kane. She sent me away when I was a boy, to keep me from a father who'd rather break us than raise us. Clara stayed. I didn't know she was here until last week. He handed the letter to the sheriff, who stood frozen by the door, his badge glinting dully in the light. The sheriff took it, his hands trembling as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the faded ink. Caleb Hawthorne scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. A letter? A convenient tale from a man who's been gone for years. This changes nothing. But his words lacked their earlier fire, and the crowd wasn't listening. They were watching Jonah, whose stillness held more power than Caleb's bluster. It changes everything, Jonah said, turning to the jury. You've judged her, without knowing her. You've buried her story because it was easier than digging for the truth. Amos Carver wasn't a saint. He was a man who broke what he couldn't own, and Clara was in his way. The jury shifted uncomfortably, their faces a mix of doubt and shame. The grocer, who'd avoided Clara's gaze earlier, now stared at his hands. The schoolteacher, who'd whispered against her, bit her lip, her eyes welling with something like regret. Judge Holt cleared his throat, trying to regain control. Mr. Kane, if that's your name, this court requires evidence, not stories. Do you have proof of your claims? Jonah's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but close. I've got proof, he said. And I've got witnesses. But first ask yourselves, why are you so quick to hang a woman who's never raised a hand against you? Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying the scent of sagebrush and secrets. Across the square, the saloon was empty, its patrons spilling into the street, drawn by whispers of the stranger who'd turned Redstone's trial upside down. The bartender, still clutching his rag, muttered to no one in particular, Kane's back. God help us all. In the courthouse, Clara's cuffs glinted as her hands shook, not from fear, but from something deeper, a spark of hope she hadn't dared feel in years. What proof did Jonah Kane hold, and how would it unravel the lies that bound Redstone Valley? The courthouse in Redstone Valley was no longer a furnace of judgment. It was a crucible, melting the town's certainties into something raw and uncertain. Jonah Kane stood at the heart of it, his shadow stretching across the floorboards like a challenge. Clara Voss sat at the defendant's table, her gray dress now a quiet defiance against the irons that no longer bound her wrists. The letter Jonah had presented, proof of their shared blood, rested in the sheriff's hands, its faded ink a silent witness to a past the town had never cared to know. But Jonah wasn't done. His eyes, cold and clear as a winter stream, held the jury captive, daring them to look away. You've heard enough lies, Jonah said, his voice steady but sharp, cutting through the courtroom's lingering chaos. Now hear the truth. He reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a small leather-bound journal, its pages worn thin by time and touch. This belonged to Amos Carver, he said, holding it aloft. Not the saint you've made him out to be, but the man who crushed anyone who stood in his way. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising like a restless wind. Judge Gideon Holt leaned forward, his stern face creased with unease. That's a bold claim, Mr. Kane, he said. You'd best have proof to back it. Jonah opened the journal, his fingers tracing the cramped handwriting. Carver kept records, he said. Not just of his cattle or his land, but of his debts. Debts he collected with more than money. He read aloud, his voice unwavering. Clara Voss, seamstress, refused to deliver message to Tanner's widow, punished accordingly. October 12th. The words landed like stones, each one heavier than the last. The jury shifted, their eyes darting to Clara, who sat still, her face pale but unyielding. Jonah continued. November 3rd. Voss questioned my accounts. Struck her for insolence. She'll learn. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The grocer's wife clutched her husband's arm, her face crumpling with guilt. The schoolteacher, who'd whispered against Clara, covered her mouth, tears brimming. Jonah closed the journal and set it on the table before Clara, as if offering it to her strength. Carver wasn't poisoned by Clara, he said. He was dying long before that night. His own doctor warned him. His heart was failing, weakened by years of rage and whiskey. But he hid it because a weak man can't rule a town. The sheriff, still holding the letter, stepped forward, his voice hesitant. I saw the bruises, he admitted, his badge glinting dully. Last spring, when Clara came to market, I asked if she needed help. She said no, said it'd only make things worse. His words hung in the air, a confession of his own silence. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, no longer accusatory but heavy with shame. Clara's attorney, Thomas Reed, found his voice at last. Your Honor, he said, standing taller. This journal, these testimonies, they prove Clara was a victim, not a murderer. Judge Holt's face reddened, his authority slipping like sand through his fingers. This is highly irregular, he sputtered, but his words lacked conviction. Before he could continue, a voice broke through the crowd, a trembling, fragile sound. I saw it too, said the widow who ran the boarding house, her hands twisting her apron. Amos Carver yelled at Clara in his yard last summer. I saw him raise his hand. I turned away. She choked on a sob, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then the blacksmith stood, his voice rough but firm. She mended my coat for free when my wife was sick. Never asked for a cent, but I saw her limping once after leaving Carver's house. I should have asked why. One by one, others rose. The saloon keeper, the preacher's daughter, even the doctor, who'd stayed silent too long. I treated Carver for his heart, the doctor confessed, his voice barely audible. He forbade me to speak of it. I should have checked Clara's injuries too. Clara's eyes, gray and steady, lifted to meet Jonah's. For the first time, a flicker of something softer passed through them. Not relief, but recognition, as if she saw in him the brother she'd lost to years and hardship. Jonah stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, meant only for her. You carried this alone too long, he said. Not anymore. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her hands, free of cuffs, trembled slightly, as if feeling the weight of a truth finally spoken. The courtroom was no longer a stage for judgment. It was a mirror, reflecting Redstone Valley's failures back at itself. Judge Holt sat back, his gavel untouched, his face hollowed by the weight of what he'd allowed. This court will recess, he said, his voice cracking. We'll review this new evidence. But his words were drowned by the crowd's murmurs, now a chorus of regret and reckoning. Outside, the wind carried the news across the square, where the saloon stood empty, its patrons whispering of Jonah Kane and the seamstress who'd stood trial alone. Clara rose, her steps steady but slow, as the sheriff led her to a holding room. Not a cell, not this time. Jonah watched her go, his hat low, his revolver still at his side. The town had begun to see her, but the truth was only half told. What secrets did Amos Carver's journal still hold, and what would it cost Redstone Valley to face them? The sun dipped low over Redstone Valley, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The courthouse, once a stage for judgment, stood quiet now, its doors ajar, as if exhaling the weight of a truth too long buried. Clara Voss walked out into the fading light, her gray dress catching the breeze, no longer a symbol of shame but a quiet testament to her resilience. Her wrists were free, the iron cuffs left behind in a holding room that would never confine her again. Beside her stood Jonah Kane, his coat dusted with the miles they'd soon travel, his revolver still at his hip but untouched, a silent promise of protection. The townsfolk lingered in the square, their faces a patchwork of guilt and awe. The grocer, who'd once turned away, now tipped his hat, his eyes downcast. The schoolteacher who'd whispered lies offered a small nod, her hands clasped tightly. Even the preacher, whose sermons had fueled the town's haste to judge, stood at the church steps, his Bible closed, his silence louder than any prayer. Redstone Valley had seen Clara Voss for the first time, not as a seamstress, not as a stranger, but as a woman who'd carried their cruelty and emerged unbroken. The trial had not resumed. It didn't need to. Judge Gideon Holt, his authority, humbled, had dismissed the charges, citing the journal and the town's testimonies as evidence of Clara's innocence. Amos Carver's legacy, once carved in stone, crumbled under the weight of his own words, preserved in ink that spoke louder than his wealth ever could. The doctor, shamed by his silence, promised to file proper records of Carver's ailments. The sheriff, his badge heavier now, vowed to listen when others turned away. Redstone Valley wasn't redeemed, not yet, but it was awake, stirred by a truth that demanded more than apologies. Clara paused at the edge of town, her eyes tracing the horizon where the mountains met the sky. Jonah stood beside her, his hat tilted low, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have to stay," he said. "Not here. Not with me. You're free to choose." Clara's lips curved, not quite a smile but close, a flicker of the girl she might have been before Redstone's. Shadows claimed her. "I've been alone too long," she said, her voice quiet but clear, like a bell ringing after years of silence. "But I don't know how to trust a road I can't see." Jonah nodded, his eyes softening, the winter in them thawing just enough to let her in. "Then we'll find it together," he said. He offered his hand not as a savior but as a brother who'd come too late, but stayed when it mattered most. Clara took it, her calloused fingers brushing his, and for the first time in years she felt the weight of her own name. Not a burden, but a beginning. They turned from Redstone Valley, their steps steady, their shadows merging with the dust that rose like a farewell. They didn't ride far, just beyond the valley's reach, to a small inn nestled at the foot of the Sierras. Its sign, weathered but proud, read, "Dawn's Promise," a name that felt like a gift after so many darkened days. Inside, the air smelled of sage and fresh bread, and a fire crackled in a stone hearth. An old woman behind the counter, her eyes kind but sharp, handed them a key without questions. "Room's yours," she said. "Rest well." Clara and Jonah sat at a wooden table, a simple meal of stew and cornbread before them. Clara ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if rediscovering what it meant to be hungry for life. Jonah watched her, not with pity but with a quiet pride. "You're stronger than I ever was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara set down her spoon, her eyes meeting his. "I didn't feel strong," she admitted. "I felt invisible." She paused, then added, "But you saw me." Jonah leaned back, his hat resting on the chair beside him. "Someone had to," he said, "and I'm sorry it took so long." In that moment, under the amber glow of the inn's lanterns, Clara Voss wasn't just a seamstress or a survivor. She was a woman reclaiming her story, stitch by stitch in a world that had tried to unravel her. Her journey wasn't over, but it was hers now, shared with a brother who'd crossed deserts to find her, and as they sat together, the fire casting warmth across their faces, they built something new. Not a vow, not a promise, but a table where two souls could sit without fear of being forgotten. In the late 19th century, women like Clara Voss were often invisible in the American West, their voices drowned by the clatter of cattle drives and the clang of saloon doors. History remembers the gunslingers and the tycoons, but it rarely speaks of the seamstresses, the widows, the women who mended the fabric of frontier towns while enduring their cruelty. Clara's story reminds us that truth, though slow to rise, can shift the course of a town, a heart, or a life. It's a testament to the power of being seen, of being heard, when the world would rather look away. If Clara's story moved you, leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible or known someone who stood up for you when no one else did? Subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage and redemption, where history and heart meet. Join us at the table. There's always a seat for you. New dawn awaits Clara Voss, and what stories will she carry into the light?